All right, now here's where we're at today. We've been studying the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. And just if you're new, I'm going to do a real brief review so you can understand where we're at. So we're calling this series Stand Strong, just like Daniel and his friends did in the midst of a culture that was diametrically opposed to where he was at. Now, just so I put it in a context, this is during the exile period. This is in the 600 BC area, 500, 580, 550 even. So it's after the heyday of Europe, the heyday. I'm back in England. The heyday of Israel, but it's before the time of Jesus by about 600 years. So it fits into the scheme of the Old Testament, or the book. I'm sorry, it's all about this. Here's the big idea of the whole book. It's that God is sovereign over all of history and all of its empires and all of the comings and goings of powers and empires and all that. That God is behind the scenes, not manipulating that, but also in charge of that. Exactly how God's sovereignty and man's free will fits together, I can't explain to you perfectly. But all I know is they're both active. But somehow in the midst of that, God is doing things. And so all the kingdoms of the world are going to come and go, but there is eventually, in the last part of Daniel, talk about the last kingdom, the kingdom of Christ that will come and it will reign forever, for 1,000 years on earth. And then when that comes to an end, then it'll be a forever in a new kingdom, in a new heaven and a new earth. And that's kind of what's going on, and that's what they're talking about, even as far back as 600 BC. So then chapters 1 through 6 that we're looking at here on primarily are about Daniel and his 3 friends, who are serving in the Babylonian court as exiles, as ones who have been captured. They took their brightest and their best and involved them in the government. And they live faithfully to the Lord in the midst of this culture that's very different from theirs. And they decide not to conform to it, but to stay really faithful to the Lord. And as a result, they bring a blessing to the Gentiles there. That God uses them in the midst of that, even though it wasn't easy. Now, this theme, I think, really will serve us well as we talk about this, because the cultures that we live in are never perfectly aligned with Christ. You know, there are always quirky things in it. And so how do we stay faithful in that and have God use us as a blessing to people? Then we won't cover them, but chapters 7 through 12 are all about the eschatological visions that he has. They're prophetic of the future that apply maybe very well to our day, but they're complicated, and they need to be seen in light of the book of Revelation and to understand what's going on there. Chapter 1 was all about understanding their identity, that who we be will determine what we do, and that standing strong in our convictions, for what you do proclaims what you believe, and that we really want to have each day be a signature of who you are. Because it is, isn't it? Every day is a signature of who we are as people, and that what we believe will speak clearly to our world. And that's really what's going on here. And then in chapter 2 is all about the authority exercised out of fear is really pathetic, and our faith is grounded in the character of God, and therefore His ability to deal with our lives, and to whom we offer praise and honor. Right? That's how it goes. Then chapter 3 was all about this. Look at this. In this world, you will be asked to conform to the norms of the culture around us, and if you don't, you will be accused of violating something unique. And if you confirm your stance, you will face contempt. It's true. It's how it goes in this world. And if we stand strong, there will be some who will be transformed and by the truth and the grace of God, who will be promoted and glorified by some of the very ones who at one point were antagonistic. It's true. It's how it works. Then, chapter 4 last week was all about this. It was about Big Nebo's difficult journey. And it's really not that dissimilar from ours. It's really about that journey from pride to humility, was what last week's chapter was all about. Now, this week, chapter 5 is going to be about Belshazzar's difficult evening. He's going to have a bad night, just so you know. This is going to be a really rotten evening for him in his own life, okay? And you'll see, it doesn't turn out well. He started out thinking he was going to a great party, and he ends up, well, we'll see where he ends up. Now, there are a cast of characters. So kids, if you're in here, this is a little bit for you. You're going to need to help us today. So there's a cast of characters, and we've changed their names. So the first one is King Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to refer to him, though he's not in the story alive. He's probably dead at this point. But we're going to call him Big Nebo. Now, the other day, I was after church, I was over at Lion's Choice, the new one. You guys ought to go. They didn't pay me to say that. But we're over there, and there was a family of kids and adults, and they were having a discussion about Nebuchadnezzar's real name. And the parents were telling the kids his real name is Big Nebo. And the kids were saying, no, it's not. It's Nebuchadnezzar. And so I walked in the door, and they said, Kevin, help us solve this discussion. And they asked me, what's his real name? And I said, well, it's Big Nebo. And the kids go, no, it's not. It's Nebuchadnezzar. So down at Children's, they're teaching them the right thing. And we're kind of messing it up here. But so you kids, when we get to King Nebuchadnezzar, his name's Big Nebo, okay? So everybody together? Big Nebo. Okay, we can eat it all the way through. Now, Daniel, we've changed his name to El Guapo because he's the handsome one. Because we had the three amigos, now we have El Guapo, the handsome one. And in chapter 1, it says that they were handsome and very intelligent. And so we have El Guapo. Also, the Most High God, we've named him the Awesome One, because that's the spirit behind it, the Awesome One, the one who is without equal, the only entity in the entire universe that is actually awe-inspiring, awesome in every way, shape, or form, all the time. So we call him the Awesome One. Now, today we're going to add this guy named King Belshazzar, which is actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He's not actually the son, he's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And because of that, we're going to call him Nebo Jr. But really, he's going to be Nebo Jr. Jr., right? Because he's a grandson. So we're just going to add it. So it's Nebo Jr. Jr. Is going to be Belshazzar. Now, there also in this story, we're going to find a queen. It's going to refer to the queen. Now, this is the daughter of Big Nebo, or Nebuchadnezzar for those of you, for you children. And it's also going to be the mother of Nebo Jr. Jr. So it's really the queen mother in this story. And we're going to name her Mama Nebo. That would be the appropriate thing. We have Mama Shu down in our student ministries. And so we're going to have Mama Nebo. Now, there's another kind of set of words that are used often here. It's called the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines. And so during this party, all of them come to the party, okay? So we're going to refer to them as the entourage. His entourage is there, okay? So you got to say it with a little bit of that French feel, that entourage, okay? So then there are some others in here, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. These were that set of people over whom Daniel had been placed as their kind of director, but they all believed a variety of different things. But they were those guys who were trying to help them predict the future and understand things that were going on. We call them the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers, and so we're going to call them the wise guys, okay? It's just the wise guys. It makes it simple. It's easy. Now, there's one more thing in this chapter that we're going to need to know on the next one. It's going to be several times it's going to refer to an offering that are offered to a variety of people, that they would be clothed with purple, which is really this royal representation. They'd be clothed with a purple robe, which would say you're of royalty. You're in the top echelon. You're in the group of power. And that's what they're offered if they could interpret what's going on here. And not only that, but they'll have a chain of gold around their neck, which is a symbol of power and of influence and of high standing. And then around his neck, and they shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. They're going to be made very, very high in the kingdom. The offer of power and influence. And so rather than reading all those words every time, we're just going to call it the bling. Okay, it's just the bling. He's offered a lot of bling of power and wealth. Okay, so that's the cast of characters. So kids, you got to help us out. When we get to each one of those, the official name will be written, but we need to give it their real name. Okay, so it'll get confusing, but we'll get there. Now, in this chapter 5, we're going to do this. We're going to see 5 things. We're going to see the setting of this event. We're going to see the incident itself. We're going to see the question that's asked as a result, the answer that comes as a result, and then the conclusion. And then we'll try to wrap it up with a big idea, see what it's trying to say to us, okay? So let's start with the unique setting. It's a very unique setting. Let's look at it. It starts out, ready? King Nebo Jr. Jr. Okay, so it's Nebo Jr. Jr. This is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, okay? So we've now skipped ahead here several years. In fact, probably Daniel is close to 80 years old at this point. When he started, way back in chapter 1, he was probably 14, 15 years old. And some of the events happened from there that we've covered is when they're in his 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s. Now we find him in his 80s, or maybe close to 80 years old. And so let's go back to verse 1. King Nebo Jr. made a great feast for thousands of lords and drank wine in front of the thousands. And then Nebo Jr., when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and the silver that Big Nebo, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem to be brought that the entourage might drink of them. Now, it seems innocent enough, doesn't it? But here all of a sudden, the things that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen out of the temple and brought back to Babylon and put in storage, because he understood that for the Jews, those vessels were sacred, used in the worship of God, and they'd kept them in the storeroom. And now Nebo Jr. is going to say, hey, we're having a great feast and a great party. Get the stuff out of the storeroom. Let's use it. Let's drink from it. Let's use it. It's just offensive, not only to the Jews, but to God himself, that they would use it in their worship. Now, look at this in verse 3. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple in the house of the awesome one, and the entourage drank from them. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone and all the idols of Babylon. Do you sense the totally defamingness of not only the Jews, but of God himself? And that they would use these to just simply throw a party and to worship these idols that have no life in them, none. Wow, it's so offensive. Look at this. Now, let's look at the incident itself. Here's the party, here's the setting, here's the incident. Look at verse 5. It says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall in the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Now, I don't know about you, but you guys, that's a weird story. Is that not a strange story or what? And just so the kids, just so they'd enjoy it. We don't know what it looked like exactly, but it probably looked a little bit like this. Okay, now, if you were at a party of thousands, yes, they'd been drinking. It says they'd been drinking. If you were at a party and all of a sudden there's a hand on the wall writing, I mean, come on. Would that freak you out or what? In fact, look at this in verse 6. Then the king's color changed. Yeah, of course. My gosh. I mean, let's think about it, really. Does this freak you out? It says the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him, understatement, and his limbs gave way. It literally means he became weak in the hips. As he stood there, he's like, can't hardly stand, and his knees knocked together. Yeah, it's almost like the Three Stooges, right? I mean, his knees are knocking together. Well, it would freak you out. This is one of those times you think, okay, is this just symbolic? Is this just some, kind of a fairy tale? Well, I think the scriptures usually speak the truth. Supernatural things happen. Not every day, not in every way, but they happen. And I have no doubt that this actually happened. I think God was trying to make a point, and he was going to make it really well. And he really freaked this guy out here for a little while. And now look in verse 7. It says the king called loudly. Yes, I get it. Calls loudly to bring in the wise guys. Okay, and the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be get the bling. Okay, they're going to get the bling. I mean, he's like, man, I will give you what you need and want. I'm going to give you a robe. I'm going to give you a chain around your neck. I'm going to make you third leader of the kingdom. Whoever can do this thing, because this is powerful. It's freaking me out, is what he's saying. It says, then the wise guys came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. They couldn't do it. Wow. You got to wonder, why couldn't they do it? But we'll get there in a minute. It says, then in verse 9, then the king, right on, Junior is greatly alarmed and his color changed and the lords were perplexed. Everybody is a little strung out right here. Then, Mama Nebo, good job, Mama Nebo, because of the words of the king and his lords, came in to the banqueting hall, and the Mama Nebo declared, oh, which king? Nebo Jr., live forever. Now she comes in with a very appropriate, this is the way you dress kings, even if you're the queen mother. She comes in and says, hey, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. You know, you're like, yeah, right. That's easy for you to say, Mom. You know, this is really happening here. Now in verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, referring back to Nebuchadnezzar, really, so this word in Hebrew can either mean father, or it can mean grandfather, or it can mean ancestor. So it's really referring back to your grandfather. In the days of your grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And Big Nebo, your grandfather, the father of the king, made him chief of all the wise guys. Okay, because an excellent, now listen to this, you guys, this is just something incredible. Because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this El Guapo, who the king named. Okay, and let's go see what he named him. Let's just run this up a little bit. And he named him Belteshazzar, and let El Guapo be called, and he will show the interpretation. She says, hey, there was this guy who served your grandfather that was amazing. I know you've heard the stories of him, basically is what she says. I know you've heard about him. I know you've never taken the time to meet him. I know he's been shoved off into a corner somewhat. But there's this guy, he helped your grandfather. Why don't you see if he could help you? So he said, makes sense to him. So look at this in verse. We're going to go to now, they're going to answer the question here. And here it's verse 13. It says, then El Guapo was brought before the king, and the king answered and said to, you are that, yeah, there's a lot of El Guapo going on here, that you are the El Guapo, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king your father brought from Judah. And I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Wow. I'd heard about you before. You have an incredible reputation. Okay, I'll engage this. Look at verse 15. And then the wise guys have been brought in before me and read the writing and made known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. They couldn't get it. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writings and make known to me the interpretation, you shall get the bling. Okay. So here's the question. Hey, tell me, what's going on here? I heard you're amazing. I heard the God you serve, the spirit of him lives in you. And this is freaking me out, man. I need help. So look at this. Then the courageous answer. And this is incredibly courageous. You can just see it. It says in verse 17, then El Guapo answered and said before the king. Now here's the deal. He doesn't say the traditional greeting. Typically he would say, O king, live forever. He comes in and kind of lays down the politeness, the politically correct thing to say, okay? And it's amazing. He doesn't say it here. Here's this man in his 70s who's like, all right, let's get after it here. I'll tell you the truth. And he says this, let your bling be for yourself and give your rewards to another. That is a powerful thing to say. It's kind of in his face a little bit, but he says, hey, look, I don't need your gifts. I don't want your power. I don't want your wealth. I don't need your influence. Keep that, give it to someone else. Wow. I think he set Nebo Jr. here back on his heels a little bit. He's like, don't offer it to me. It's not important to me. It's not what I live for. Wow. But then he says this in verse 17, nevertheless, I will read the writings of the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the awesome one gave Big Nebo, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. You see, God was working in your grandfather's life in a really powerful way. And if we remember the story, he had both blessed him, but he also then drove him to humility. And when he came to humility and came to his senses, God blessed him in an amazing way and gave him amazing power. Not that he used the power correctly all the time, but he gave him amazing power. Look at this, in fact, in the rest of 19. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. And whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. He gave Nebuchadnezzar that power. Wow. But when his heart was filled up and his spirit was hardened, this means when his heart was filled up with himself. And when his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. Look at verse 21. And he was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was that of the wild donkeys. And he was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet in the dew of heaven, until he knew that the awesome one rules the kingdom of man and sets over it whom he will. Wow. Then he goes on, and you, his son, Nebo Jr. Good job. Have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. He knew. He'd heard the stories. He understood. He probably had met his grandfather and his father, Nabonidus. And he'd heard these stories. He knew all about it. But he became full of himself. But you have lifted up yourself against the awesome one. He had decided to stand in opposition to the awesome one. Wow. All right, well, let's look at the last part of 23. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and the entourage has drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which you do not see or hear or know. These dead idols. You've made a big deal out of it. And you have violated the awesome one in order to do it out of your own arrogant pride. Wow. But then if we should ever, I always tell you, circle your butt. So let's circle this one. But this is a huge transition here. This is an amazing statement. But the God, and now let's circle this. The God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. I think that's the main point of this whole chapter. And it's an amazing statement. He says to him, hey, Nebo Jr., the God whose hand holds your breath, your very life, and in whom is all your ways, you've decided to compete with him. See, normally we don't really decide whether we'll worship God or not. We decide if we will compete with him or not. And here we find Nebo Jr. competing with God. He said, I'm going to take all the vessels of your temple and I'll use them in the service and in the worship of dead idols. And see how you like that, God. Wow. That Nebo Jr. would refuse to honor God with who he was as a person. Wow. Well, let's go on and see what happens. Then from his presence, in verse 24, the hand was sent and this writing was inscribed, and this is the meaning that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and the Pharsin. Now, you guys, I know that you probably, none of us know Aramaic very well. This is probably Aramaic, which is a very close relationship to Hebrew. And here's what these words actually mean. Mene, Mene, we'll fill it in here. It really actually means this. It stands for mina, which is a monetary a high monetary. It's like a big, like $100 bill, if you will. So it's a lot. It referred to that. But what it really refers to is this, is it means counted. It comes from the verb to count. Or in the passive participle that it's used in this, it's really counted. It means, so that's all it meant right there. And so it's going to be interpreted here in a minute. But tekel really comes from the word shekel. But actually what it means in its verb is to be weighed. In its passive participle, weighed. So we have here counted and weighed. And then farson really comes from a half a shekel, is what it means. But really in its verb form, it means to be divided, or to divided in its passive participle. So we have counted, weighed, and divided. Now, what it means, it says that those guys didn't know what it meant. It was probably in Aramaic, and you think, well, why didn't they understand it? And either it was written in such a way, well, let me just look at this. This is an interesting, I think, we don't know if this is true or not, but this is Rembrandt's painting called Belshazzar's Feast. And so he painted this. Now, Rembrandt lived most of his life in Amsterdam, and he lived primarily in the Jewish sector of town. And so most of his best friends were all Jewish. And so when he would do paintings, especially from the Old Testament, he would always converse with his Jewish friends. And he'd say, hey, what do you think it looked like? Or what do you think, or what's going on here? And they'd help him. And so when he did this, there was a particular rabbi there in Amsterdam who said, well, here's why they couldn't read it. And so he said, well, here, you see, the Hebrew always goes from right to left. Okay, so when you pick up a Hebrew Bible, you read from the back to the front, and you read from the right to the left. And so that would be the typical way to do it. And so he said, but that's not the way it was done in this story. The reason they couldn't read it is because it went top to bottom. And so he painted this with the Hebrew going from top to bottom, and so they couldn't really read it. Now, we don't know if that's why they couldn't read it or understand it, or maybe they could read the letters, but just didn't know the meaning of what was he saying when they were talking about all this stuff of counted, weighed, and divided. But I think that's a very interesting idea, that maybe it had gone top to bottom rather than right to left. But so here's the interpretation of it in the scriptures in verse 26. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, meaning God has numbered the days of your kingdom, and it's been brought to an end. And it's said twice, right? Mene, mene, meaning the emphasis on it. Not only has it been numbered, but it's coming to an end. In fact, it's coming to an end quickly. Can you imagine being the guy who gets to give the interpretation? Okay, Nebo Jr., hey, I'll give it to you, but here's the deal. Your days have been numbered, and it's coming really fast. Wow. Okay, and then the next one, tekel, meaning shekel, or maybe the idea of being weighed. You have been weighed in the balance, and you've been found wanting. You've been found short. Wow. And then, Pheren, or here in Pezes, the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. It's going to be given up. Wow. It's incredible. Now, let's see what happens. Here's the stunning conclusion. It says, then Nebo Jr. gave the command, and El Guapo was given the bling. So he got all the bling. But then it says, and it didn't last though. He got it that night. He got his purple robe, he got the gold chain, he got the third ruler in the kingdom, because probably Nebo Jr. was a co-regent with his father, and so the father was really first in the kingdom. Nebo Jr. was the next. And then it was going to be Daniel. It lasted a couple of hours. That's it. That's all it lasted. Because look in verse 30. It says, that very night, Nebo Jr., the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. You see, somehow, Nebo Jr. threw a party, either ignorant that just outside the walls of Babylon were the armies of the Medes and the Persians, or he knew they were out there and was so arrogant, he still threw a party and didn't think it would happen, that they'd take over. All they had to do was divert the Euphrates River out of the city, and they could come in knee-deep water, and they took over with no violence whatsoever. They just took over. And they took Nebo Jr. aside, and they killed him. Wow, can you imagine that? It's amazing. And so we have this guy who thought he was so powerful. And yet God took him down in a moment as the Medes and the Persians came in. Darius was probably the general of the army. Eventually we would find Cyrus, who was really the king of all of Babylon, which is one of the biggest empires in the history of the world. And they come in and they take over. Wow. So here's this incredible story, right? We have this amazing setting. We have an incredibly strange incident. We have questions asked. We have answers given. And then there's a conclusion. So therefore, what's that all about? And here's what I think the big idea is today. Is this. A couple of things. One is that every generation has a personal decision to make, right? Remember the story of what Nebuchadnezzar, a big Nebo? And how the process that God used to bring him to humility and to bless him, and that at the end of his life, the last time we saw him back in chapter 4, is he was saying, this God of heaven is awesome. He is the awesome one. And then he disappears from the story. We don't know for sure if he came to faith. It seems to me in chapter 4 he did. And it was real, and it was personal, and it was powerful, and it was unique. He made decisions. But here's the deal. It didn't get passed on to Nebo Jr., did it? You see, every generation has their own decision to make. Every person. You see, no one, just because you grow up in a church doesn't make you a Christian, right? It's a personal decision. Everyone has to decide. And you never know what they're going to decide. Every generation has a decision to make. And it seems to me the decision is this. It is, will we honor the God in whose hand is our breath? Will we honor the God in whose hands are all of our ways? Or will we pursue the short-term bling, the cheap trinkets of this world that replace the awesome one? It's a decision every generation has to make. Every person has to make. I can't ride the coattails of my grandparents. My grandfather, my grandmother were really neat Christian people. We used to go to their house, and you know how you go to Grandma and Grandpa's house, you just like explore every nook and cranny. And then once in a while you have to use the restroom. And I went in the restroom, and my grandfather's Bible was right there. I don't know why it was in the restroom. Who would do that? But it was in the restroom, and I was reading it. And he had these prayers that he'd written stuck in his Bible. And they were amazing. I couldn't even explain them. But somehow, in my mom's generation, they all said, no, thank you. They all said, no. It seemed a bit much. And so they all kind of said goodbye to it, on the most part. So I didn't grow up in a church. I didn't grow up going to church. We went a little bit. My parents didn't really ever come in. They dropped us off down at Sunday school, and they'd drive around the corner. And I don't remember thinking or even trying to figure out where they were going because we were just anxious to run across the street to the downtown YMCA and play basketball. And that's what we'd do every week. We'd go across, play basketball for an hour, make it back. They'd come, pick us up, and we'd go home. God was never mentioned in our home. We didn't talk about him. It's not like he was taboo. We just didn't know how to do it. We knew how to play basketball. We knew how to play baseball. We knew how to play football. Those were all great. Had a great time. But I never heard God in my home. It was only later when I came to a place where I came to a personal faith. But it had to be personal, right? It had to be my decision. Right here, we find that Nebo Jr. couldn't buy into Nebo's faith unless he made it personal. And it seemed to have skipped a generation. The Bonadists didn't really buy it. Wow. And so it's really a personal decision. Will we honor God who holds our breath in his hand? I love that saying, isn't it? There's something so personal about that. And in whose hands are all of our ways. Will we honor him? Or will we not? Sometimes I don't even know how to engage that thought because it seems so hard. But it's really maybe so simple. Are we going to serve ourselves or will we serve him? Here's the second thought I'd like to just throw out. The bling is so easily, that it so easily entices us is so short-lived, isn't it? It's what happened in Daniel's life. He got the bling, right? And it lasted about 2 hours, and it was gone. The bling that we look for in life, and it's so gone so quickly. The things that you ache for and look for and want so badly, and yet they fall apart. And it's all sorts of stuff. And last week I told you about the pair of shoes when I was a high school kid. And it was just turned out terrible. Or the relationship that you hang on to so tightly, but it's not the right one. I was dating a girl in college, and after a year, I knew we should break up. I knew it. And I waited another year and a half. And it was one of the worst decisions of my whole life. Because in that year and a half, it went downhill and went downhill fast. And it went where it shouldn't have gone. Why did I hang on to that? Because she had become my bling. Or maybe it's a job. Or maybe I don't know what it is in our lives. What's the bling that so easily entices you that really just is short-lived? It's not worth it. What is it? So, Philip Henry said this one time. This is the guy I told you about earlier that we're so glad we didn't have to study. He said this: "He is not a fool who parts with that which he cannot keep, when he is sure to be recompensed for that which he cannot lose." That's right. Jim Elliot, one of our favorite stories in more modern day in the 20th century, a missionary to Ecuador who lost his life to the Auca Indians. He said this in his journal, having read Philip Henry. He said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." And we spend so much of our lives trying to gain that which we're going to lose, to collect stuff, relationships, whatever it is that would satisfy our innards. We work so hard at it, don't we? And yet it's going to go. And we don't give much thought to that which we cannot lose. The eternity of a God in whose hand is our breath, and in whose hands are all of our ways, to give him our heart. So it takes me back to the very basic things. From the very beginning is this: what are we told that we should value? But to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your strength, with all of your soul. And to love your neighbor as if they were you. And it seems to me that that's exactly what is going on in the life of Nebo Jr., who bought into all the wrong things because he would not honor the God who gives him life. And so what an incredibly beautiful opportunity that we have to stop and to say, I give it all. I surrender it all. We already sang it this morning, didn't we? Surrender it all to the God who has me in his hands, the one who loves me so deeply, the one who knows everything about me, both good and bad, and still I am the object of their affection. Is that an amazing thought? So as the band comes up, we're going to close. As the band comes up, I want us just to think through the incredible power this year in our lives to say, what would it look like to honor him? Because he's the one who gives me breath. That he's the one in whose hands are all of my ways. I can trust him with it. Whatever it might look like. When life becomes hard, when life becomes threatened, when life is difficult, that you don't back away. You say, God, I need you even more. I don't want you to be. So this week, many of you know, Diane was in the hospital for a couple of nights, really a night and a half, and her heart went kind of weird. It went AFib, so it means the top part of it goes kind of crazy, spastic, if you will. And it has a hard time pumping blood. And you don't want that very long because when it can't get blood out of there, it begins to clot, and then when clots go to other places, clots do bad things. And I thought, wow, I'd hate to lose her. Now, it all fixed, so she's good. But I thought, wow, that relationship's so important to me. But I thought, is my relationship with God even more important to me? That if I were to lose it, I'd be lost. And so often I don't act like that. So much of this world is so more important to me. And yet it's going to get taken in one way or another someday, right? I can't hold on to it all the time. Someday my house is going to get either knocked down or burned up. I don't know which one. Someday I'm going to lose all the stuff of life, but we'll never lose him. Wow. And I think he's calling us to honor him with our souls. So if you will, just take a moment and say, okay, God, where are you at in my life? Where am I at in your life? Are you that important to me, God? And if you're not, God, I want that. I want to move back towards you. I want to turn my face towards you. I want to see the breath of my life in your hand and my ways in your hands, and to give it to him. I think that's what he's calling us to. And then somehow life looks really different from that place. So why don't you just take a moment, think it through, pray it through, wrestle with it, and then we'll sing together here in a minute or two.